Given the broad geographical and chronological focus of the workshop, we are all sure to learn a lot of new things over the next 2 days. For my contribution, I decided to formulate a few observations and to tell some stories on the dynamics of urban religious communication in late medieval East Central Europe, with particular attention to Prague in the 14th and in the first half of the 15th century, in which the question of multilingualism and religion and urban space took on a very special twist. This is not an urban space. Actually, I will show more of this. This is the one of the paintings of Alphonse Mucha from the cycle The Slavonic Epopee. It is in the museum in Moravský Krumlov, and if you shouldn't not know, maybe trip for a weekend, this is really good because they are huge. They are something like 20 meters, still 30 meters, and there are lots of them, and it's about the history of Slavs. And I choose them because Mucha and his collaborators, also historians and philologists and literary scholars, they really tried to be as historically accurate as possible. That means we will see then another slide, another painting of his, in which an urban space is depicted, which is really quite well done. Of course, the modern research changed this or that, but in the basic sense, it is very good reconstruction. In the Latin Europe of the late Middle Ages, the relationship between practice, religion, languages, and urban space took on a special dynamic in the mendicant orders and their offensive pastoral care. Both Northern Italian and South French foundations spread throughout the Roman Empire at an era-depleting speed, and in a certain sense became an integral part of the so-called Eastern colonization of the 13th century. As Eastern colonization, the research labels the influx of the mainly German-speaking population from the western part of the Roman Empire into the areas inhabited mainly by Slavic-speaking populations. This influx created a situation of competitive multilingualism within a few decades. The new arrivals were often granted significant social, political, and cultural privileges by the ruling elites. They were specialists who were supposed to establish highly developed mining technologies and bring iron and precious metals processing, as well as trade up to speed in the ambitious polities, where at the turn of the 14th century, the native dynasties had died out and power-hungry Western ruling families took over the rule. In Bohemia, the Luxembourgs. Since the majority of the new arrivals were German-speaking, it is hardly surprising that the native population, especially the upper classes, soon connoted the language and its speakers negatively in order to deal with the economic and political differences perceived as injustice. This linguistic nationalism, I call it that, although nationalism is understood by myself as a decidedly ahistorical term, was always dependent on economic and political stability. In times of instability, linguistic nationalism grew. In stable conditions, it disappeared from the public discourse or even quasi-public sphere entirely. By increasing or decreasing stability, we do not necessarily mean particular economic changes, such as a drastic impoverishment of the population due to severe economic or ecological crisis, but rather a surplus of elites who had to share the available resources. Dynamics that Petr Turchin described in his hypothesis of elite overproduction is observable in the given time very well. The beginning of the late Middle Ages in Latin Europe is marked by several waves of elite overproduction, the emergence of the medieval universities and the foundation of the Franciscan and Dominican orders, and the bureaucratization of papal curia were among the most important of these. The mendicant orders became a response of the institutional church to the widely shared desire in society for ecclesiastical renewal. They were intended to serve as a bulwark against the spreading heterodox movements through the intensive religious education of the faithful, in the same time supporting, through its highly educated members, the advancing bureaucratization of the curial apparatus. In general, renewal was seen in a return to the original function of the Christian community. That means prayer and an exemplary, strictly Christian way of life based on the ideals of the apostolic community, modesty, abstinence, and poverty, which was in quite the opposite in which the development went, bureaucratization, intellectual elite, and so on and so on. Okay, return to modesty, abstinence, and poverty, fine. I mean, this ideal was to be conveyed to the community through preaching, whereby it was often the personal example of the preacher, authentic or not, that gave weight to his words. However, the demand for complete poverty, modesty, and abstinence often represented a quixotic challenge for both the preacher and his listeners. The history of repeated attempts at reform, a fixture of the European religious landscape since the 10th century, points to a fundamental problem in this claim that remained unresolved within the universal church. The discrepancy between the ideal and the lived reality became a particular explosive problem in the mendicant orders, especially because of their close interaction with their surroundings in the urban environment, where every transgression became public knowledge. Their exalted claim to Christian perfection was precarious in a sense, because it was formulated in direct comparison with the secular clergy, which then inevitably observed with a particular critical eye how far their competitors for the rich urban believers would fulfill their own demands. The ambitious pastoral work of the Franciscans and Dominicans of the 13th century gave the duty of preaching, which was more often than not shifted from the beneficiaries to chaplains, a whole new dynamic and significance. The urban space provided an ideal platform for the theatrical self-presentation demanded by the new form of the mendicant moral sermon, with its urgent appeal for renewal. Despite this very plausible assumption, the first East Central European testimonies to the mendicant preaching offensive that we possess do not concern the urban space. And this is it. In the Chronicle of the Glads Franciscans, a very early foundation supported by Bohemian kings, the following record can be found for the year 1272. On the feast of Saint Lucy, on the feast of Saint Lucy, the Virgin, the brother Berthold of Regensburg also happily passed away. A great preacher in various provinces, namely Thuringia and Bohemia, where he had as his interpreter a Saint Peter, surname Oderincius, who is buried in Glatz. And their brother Berthold preached in a field under a linden tree. Okay, this was not a linden tree. Never mind. Under a linden tree, which to this day is called Berthold's tree, which I myself have seen, the author writes, with my own eyes near Glatz. It is a rare testimony which perhaps gives us at least a partial idea of how religious instruction took place in a multilingual environment. Berthold of Regensburg joined the Franciscan order in the 1230s, that means very early on, and was active and important mendicant centers of the Roman Empire, above all in Magdeburg, Regensburg, and Augsburg. His popularity as a preacher grew over the decades. 200 years after his death, his sermons, of which numerous Latin collections have been preserved, were still part of the golden standard of Franciscan sermonizing and were eagerly used by both religious and clerical preachers in everyday pastoral care. Bertold himself preached in the vernacular, in Middle High German. His sermons were so popular that, according to several sources, not only the churches, but also the town squares and other spaces were inadequate for the crowds of listeners. In Graz, for example, where Bertold preached several times on his journey to Bohemia, the town space was too small for Bertold and his audience. They had together under a tree in the open field. Considering the size of the spaces in medieval towns of the time, whether we are talking about church buildings or squares, it is not really surprising that the visit of the famous man required special measures. In Graz, we can assume with some certainty that both German and Slavic-speaking believers attended Bertold's sermons. How the multilingualism of the congregation was dealt with could certainly have been very different. We have many testimonies, especially from Bohemia, where the multilingualism of the community of believers had been repeatedly addressed in different ways since the second half of the 14th century at the latest. They show us how complicated this could sometimes be to handle. Bertold of Regensburg apparently had a personal interpreter, a certain Petr Odranec, which more or less means a vagabond, possibly a Czech-speaking Franciscan who traveled with him to the various mendicant centers of the Kingdom of Bohemia. It is not clear how a speech by a famous preacher could have been interpreted, but it is very likely that it was translated according to meaningful blocks of speech. One can imagine that something similar could have been organized for another famous preacher, the Austrian Augustinian canon, Konrad of Waldhausen, who, at the invitation of Charles IV, preached widely acclaimed penitential sermons in Prague in the 1350s. The events can probably also be seen as a self-presentation of the emperor and the courtly society as exemplary penitents directed at urban space and urban society in the capital. We have no evidence from Prague of a lack of space that would force the community into an open air. Charles IV's building activities were basically focused on expanding the urban and the church space so that the city could easily absorb large gatherings of people. Under his rule, Prague was to be the center of the empire and as such was to be prepared for the most important imperial ceremonies. We know the multilingualism of Konrad of Waldhausen's environment from the sources of his numerous lawsuits brought against him by the Prague mendicants, because he was a very serious competitor. They saw him, as well as the Augustinian canons in general, as a welcome competition for the souls and wallets of the wealthy citizens of Prague. As mentioned above, the majority of these were German-speaking at the time, especially the merchant patrician families, but the lower nobility were Czech-speaking, as were some powerful guild organizations. For the 1360s, Konrad Waldhauser's own testimony provides a sense of the practical limits to bilingualism in Prague. Some of those who heard him preach in German didn't understand him, as Waldhauser claimed in his defense against accusation brought by the Franciscans. We have therefore be careful and do not take it at face value. We have be careful and do not take it at face value because just he defended himself. One of the charges depended on a notary testimony about Waldhauser's preaching, because the friars, they tried to raise the accusation of heresy against him. Upon examination, Waldhauser responded, it was discovered that the notary was purus bohemus, and I preached in German. In other words, Waldhauser claimed that this non-German speaker, the notary, which means an educated man versed in Latin, was, as a Czech, automatically unable to understand German, which actually is quite improbable. We can probably expect a higher degree of bilingual individuals among the Czech native speakers than among the Germans. in Prague, simply because it was in the economic interest of the Czech craftsmen and Czech intelligentsia to learn the language of the rich merchants who distributed their products for the craftsmen and created their jobs for the intelligentsia. Yeah, this is the building activity in Prague under Charles IV. After all, Waldhauser's ardent follower and admirer, Meletius of Krems, was purus bohemus, but was able to preach several times in a day, alternately for Czech-speaking as well as German-speaking audience. However, it cannot be ruled out that he was an exception. Waldhauser used purus bohemus as a designation of inability or purported inability of an individual to understand German. He used a similar construction elsewhere to refer to the French Master General of the Dominican Order, Simon of Langres, who for a time led by mendicant opposition to Waldhauser in Prague. The Master General, Waldhauser argues, hadn't formed his own opinion on Waldhauser's preaching, and for he was purus Gallicus, and thus the preacher implies hadn't been able to understand the German sermons. In this case, Waldhauser is of course not claiming that the Dominican Master General, again a very well-educated man, didn't speak German. On yet another occasion, Waldhauser describes a limited ability to understand German in similar terms. One man was a partisan of the mendicants in the beginning of my preaching in Prague, that means his adversary, but it is no my good friend, for he was not able to understand me well, since he was bohemus. And here again, he says, okay, this accusation of heresy, they just are based on misunderstanding because the people who accuse me, they just didn't understand my German. This statement is particularly interesting. It may, of course, be that the French spoke the lingua franca of the Latin Middle Ages just as well as Waldhauser, Latin, but the argument is repeated. The preacher could apparently only be understood by puri teutonici. Unfortunately, it is not known whether the argument was useful in his defense, but the fact that he used it repeatedly proves that language and comprehension problems were common when preaching in multilingual congregations happened. However, we have to reckon with a certain level of practical bilingualism in the interactions between the Czech-speaking and German-speaking inhabitants of Prague. A groundbreaking study of Jaroslav Mezník from the 1960s of German-sounding and Czech-sounding names of householders at the start of the 15th century confirms Prague mixed population. The presence of loan words in each language confirms also practical bilingualism. There is a passage famous in Czech philology in the exposition on the Decalogue by the Prague Reformed theologian Jan Hus, which proves the mutual linguistic influence of the Czechs and Germans in Prague at the beginning of the 15th century. In his exposition on the Old Testament, written book of Nehemiah, written in Czech, Hus has written, and really, just as Nehemiah whipped and beat the Jewish children who couldn't speak Jewish but half Azotic, the people from Prague and the Czechs should be whipped who speak half Czech and half German and say tobolka instead of tobolka, líko instead of víko, handtuch instead of ubrusec, shorts instead of zástěrák, knedlík instead of šiška, renlík instead of trénoška, panciéř instead of kruněř, hunškop instead of konský náhlavek, marštale instead of konice, mázhaus instead of svrchní sieň, trepky instead of chódy, mantlík instead of pláštěk, hausknecht instead of domovní pacholek, forman instead of vozataj. And who could enumerate how the Czech language has already been corrupted, so that the true Czech hears that they speak, but he doesn't understand them. And from that arises envy, anger, conflict, strife, and Czech humiliation. It would, of course, be interesting to ask how exactly Hus arrived at this list of new loanwords, because they are all of them. This is not German, it's just chairman. Somehow, you know, no German person would actually recognize that there is some German basis of this word. What was actually, how did he know that these are new words? It is highly probable that the awareness of what was a correct Czech expression at the beginning of 15th century was determined in the time by the translation of the entire Bible, which took place under the patronage of Charles IV in the 1360s, and which gave the language a canonical lexicon, which was somehow unmovable. However, further research has to prove this, which is now done in my team. Because, you know, it's quoted everywhere in the Czech philology, but nobody asked how he actually came that this is new, this is old, this is proper, this is improper. This is really an open question. Some areas of the city of Prague in the given time had more German speakers and others more Czech speakers, but the overall picture is one of the intermingling. Such evidence contributes to the suggestion that Czechs and Germans coexisted peacefully during the reign of Charles IV, economic rise, great stability, with signs of division between two language communities appearing especially in the decade after the emperor's death in 1378, with the increase of political instability. Language differences undoubtedly affected the practice of religion in the city. Nearly all parishes included both Czechs and Germans. Inhabitants, furthermore, were required to attend their geographically determined parish church, which means parish communities were undoubtedly mixed. The Latin liturgy didn't entirely remove the challenges this must have posed, because central aspects of parish religion took place in the vernacular language. Prague's synodal statutes from 1343 enjoined local priests to teach lay people the Lord's Prayer and the Creed in their own languages, using the diocese-approved Czech and German translations. We know that not all Prague priests mastered both languages. Maybe Melitius of Kramsir was indeed an exception. An exceptional extant source, the protocol of the visitation in the individual parishes of the Prague diocese, carried out by the Archdeacon Pavel of Janovice in 1379, contains valuable information in this respect. The records reveal the problems that resulted from the multilingualism in the community. Some parishioners, unable to speak or confess in Czech, complained that they lacked anyone to hear their German confessions. Other lay people, whose wealthy parish boasted both a parish priest and a preacher, complained that they needed an additional German-speaking preacher so that the parish German speakers wouldn't instead visit other churches. Some other parishes did hire a preacher to the Germans, but not separate Czech preacher, which was again criticized by the Czech-speaking parishioners. In other words, not all parishes served both their Czech and German faithfuls well when it came to preaching and hearing confessions. The rich Czech-speaking citizens of Prague reacted to the situation in their own way. And this is a quite accurate historical reconstruction of the space. In 1391, they founded the so-called Bethlehem chapter for the sole purpose of Czech preaching. It was an extraordinarily large space that could hold up to 3,000 people, which had serious consequences some 20 years after its foundation. In the year 1402, the university master and theologian Jan Hus mounted the pulpit in Bethlehem chapter, strategically placed not far from the university, as well as at the borders between the old, more German, and the new, more Czech town of Prague. Old town, yeah, as I said, was German dominated, the new town Czech dominated. Whose engagement in the Bethlehem chapter was the beginning of a process in which the vernacular became an instrument of a newly defined political communication, in which, besides the economic and political elites, the social strata which had had no say in power decisions, burghers, artisans, women, municipal poor, played also their part. Who's found this heterogeneous society in the rather egalitarian conceived architecture of the chapter as an audience who were able to accept his increasingly radical opinions regarding church reform probably more easily than this could have happened elsewhere. Whose direct predecessors at the pulpit were two university masters, ardent moral preachers. Jan Hus tried to emulate the high standard and the reformist tenor of the Bethlehem sermons to which the audience members were accustomed. The importance of the interaction between Hus, the preacher, and the demanding Bethlehem community, a huge one, whose opinions had been formed by his highly intellectual precursors, can hardly be overestimated. Even before Hus started to preach in Bethlehem chapter, there was a practice of singing religious songs during the celebration of Mass, where the lay community had an active share in the religious ritual, and which meant, to a certain extent, crossing the boundary between professional mediators of the faith and the receivers. The exposition of the gospel in the mother tongue shared between the preacher and the public, choral singing in vernacular, and the shared critical view of the church routine with which fervent preachers confronted the lay audience, all this naturally fostered a community spirit and, in a sense, a shared spirit of exclusiveness. Jan Hus took up this atmosphere very actively, so that he turned in a few years at the pulpit of Bethlehem chapter from a zealous university moralist to a city tribune. Without the Bethlehem chapter, this wouldn't have been possible. Hus formulated the main reform ideas in his densely formulated tractate De Sex Erroribus, which played a central part in his concept of shaping the reform-minded public. Not only did he quote from it in a number of his tracts and sermons, both in Czech and Latin, but he also made a complete Czech translation. In this, he refers both to the Latin model and its specific mediatization. The Latin version of the tractate decorated the walls of the Bethlehem chapter during his office. That means the text became an integral part of the sacred space. Although Hus addressed this form of publication of his ideas, in fact, it was a collection of annotated citations from authorities put in context, directly to the end users, that means visitors of the chapter, it is not even remotely possible that the Latin texts on the walls, they were written very small, so you just couldn't read it. They are not there anymore. But they were discovered, the traces of it during the restoration works in the 20th century. It is not even remotely possible that the Latin texts on the walls were meant to be read by the general public. The preacher could quote from them during a sermon, but at the time when the inscriptions were painted, Hus preached in Bethlehem chapter in person, and undoubtedly didn't need such a costly aid. And this applied equally to his successors. Hus himself gives in his Czech translation of the tract the reason for the publication of the 6 errors on the walls of Bethlehem chapter as instruction for priests who are to steer clear of the most serious priestly errors with the help of these texts. They must not claim that they are creators. They must not order people to believe in anything other than the creator. They must not claim that they can absolve by themselves people from their sins. They must not claim that people must obey the powers that be in every way. They must not claim that any of their maledictions is effective And finally, they must not commit the sin of simony. The reason for publishing the text of the Sex Erroribus on the walls of the chapter was probably more presumptuous than a mere admonishment for the priests. The tract stood by the side of the Czech versions of the principal texts of the Christian teaching, the Credo, the Lord's Prayer, and the Decalogue, which were also painted on the walls. Who's ordered to be painted on the walls earlier? This placement raised the 6 errors quite to a new level of importance. From a learned treatise containing certain ideas of one author, which were on the same level as any number of tracts with a similar focus penned by a number of authors with the same education background and endowed with the same weight of the word, it became an iconic message of the fundamental truth on the plane of a profession of faith. The impression of this way of mediatization on the lay visitor of the chapter can hardly be overestimated. Transforming the texts to an image and its content from the discourse of university debate to the discourse of revealed iconic dogma on the walls of the sacred space imparted to it the weight of a doctrine which could hardly be compared with any other text apart from the Bible. Because the iconic discourse was essentially reserved for the text of the Bible. The text of the tract on the walls of the chapter clearly and directly refer to the role of the biblical citations in iconography. Unlike the Credo, the Lord's Prayer, and the Decalogue, which were painted in Czech and were meant to elevate the vernacular language to the plane of a holy language, the content of the tract remained in Latin. Although there was, of course, available the Czech version in the time. The content of the tract remained in Latin, which was generally the language for the iconographic use of biblical citations. Besides, both the text of the tract and its argumentation remained close to the layman without a professional mediator, and thus became a mystery of true faith. Hus only translated the Sex Erroribus into the vernacular in exile, when both groups of his target followers from the ranks of university students and priests on the one hand, and members of the nobility and Prague burghers on the other, blended into one. He was exiled after the so-called indulgence riots of 1412, which can be seen as a rupture in the development of the Bohemian Reformation from a university discussion about a more or less peaceful religious movement with universalist claims to a confession with proto-nationalist features. It was here that the far-reaching rift occurred between the University Reform Party and the previously reform-minded representative of the secular power, the Bohemian King Wenceslas IV. So, and now I will just narrate the course of action during these indulgence trials, because the urban space plays a very important role in it. In the autumn, but some historical facts, okay. In the autumn of 1411, Pope John the 23rd, newly elected at the Council of Pisa, proclaimed a crusade against the rebellious king of Naples, Ladislaus. As a supporter of the former Pope Urban VI, Ladislaus was at the time putting his apostolic holiness under great military pressure. The proclaimed crusade was accompanied by full indulgences for all believers who contributed financially. Not that the European ruling houses cared much about the difficulties in which the former pirate Baldassare Cosa, alias John the 23rd, was in. Some even outright refused to allow the preaching of the crusade and indulgences in their countries. In Bohemia, the king supported the crusade and indulgence campaign, probably for political strategic reasons, and thus gave the reform zealots at his own university a real slap in the face. Jan Hus immediately protested to the king himself with the harshest judgment of the Pope. When he achieved nothing, he turned to the university. While the artistic faculty begged him, the theological faculty followed the king's orders. The royal council tried to calm heated debates between the doctors and professor, but was unsuccessful. Meanwhile, Hus addressed the lay people, frustrated as he was, with full force from the pulpit in the Bethlehem chapter. The city was soon in flames. In the streets, young craftsmen and students raged with shame and mockery against the indulgences. Chests placed in the cathedral for the collection of the donations were constantly smeared with feces and rubbish. The riots culminated on May 12th in a viciously mocking procession in which a student dressed as the Pope and the Babylonian whore at the same time distributed fake indulgences from a stretcher to the bystanders, followed by a colleague disguised as a prelate on a donkey who proclaimed this Pope's deeds and fame. The imitation papal bowl of indulgence was then burned on the Old Town Square to great cheers from those present. The carnivalesque riot ended tragically. A number of craftsmen disrupted the church services by mocking indulgences, and 3 of them were summarily executed for this offense under a fresh, harsh decree issued by the king against troublemakers. Hus was banned from the church, to which he responded with a publicized appeal to Christ. That means there is no other authority who can just prohibit my preaching. This act was followed by an attack by opposing party, mainly the German inhabitants of Prague, on the Bethlehem chapter, probably on October 30th in 1412, in which Hus continued to preach despite the ban. Although this event was less bloody than the siege of the Dominican convent in San Marco in Florence in 1498, which ended Savonarola's rule over Florence, the participants had probably abandoned the storming of the chapel at the last moment. A similar dynamic can be observed in both urban reformatory movements. Even though the external and internal conditions, people involved, time and space were very different. The similarity in the dynamics of the revolt therefore resulted quite obviously from the similar mechanisms and strategies of publicizing that both reformers, Hus and Savonarola, and the circles gathered around them set in motion in an urban space.